I learned one thing that day. Sometimes the truth isn't whispered behind closed doors. Sometimes it crashes into your life when you least expect it. It started with a phone call. I was sitting at my desk, half distracted by emails, when my phone buzzed. It was an unusual caller, Mrs. Ellis, the mother of my best friend, Andrew. Her voice was tight, trembling. "Andrew's been in an accident," she said, and for a few seconds the words didn't make sense. My brain stalled. I'd spoken to Andrew 2 hours before. He was his usual self, cracking jokes, asking me about my work trip to England next week. He'd even offered to give me a ride to the airport. I remember brushing him off, laughing about how he always volunteered for boring tasks. But now, my oldest friend, more like a brother, was lying in a hospital in a city 2 hours away. A business trip gone horribly wrong. I don't remember what I said to Mrs. Ellis. I hung up and sat there, stunned, the weight of it settling in. My mind immediately turned to my wife, Emma. Emma didn't like Andrew much. Their personalities clashed, his loud, sarcastic sense of humor versus her quiet, more calculated demeanor. She often skipped our get-togethers or stayed distant when he came over. But when I walked into the living room and told her the news, her reaction was something I didn't see coming. She fell to the floor. Not stumbled, collapsed. She buried her face in her hands and started to sob like I just told her her whole world had crumbled. I stood there, frozen, my instincts telling me something wasn't right. This wasn't the reaction of someone mildly upset about their husband's friend being in an accident. This was deeper. "Emma." I crouched down next to her, putting a hand on her shoulder. She was trembling. She didn't look at me, just kept shaking her head and muttering. "No, no, no, no. He's going to be okay," I said, trying to reassure her. "We don't know anything yet. He might walk out of the hospital tomorrow." And that's when she whispered something that sent my world into a freefall. "I loved him." My breath caught in my throat. "What?" Her eyes met mine, wide and red-rimmed. I thought I'd misunderstood, my brain scrambling for a logical explanation. But she didn't let me misinterpret it. She said it again, this time louder. "I loved him, Daniel." The floor felt like it shifted under me. My mind was racing through 1,000 scenarios, trying to explain her words in any way but the one that made sense. But I couldn't deny it. "You're telling me," my voice was hoarse, "that you and Andrew—" She nodded, guilt etched across her face. It wasn't supposed to happen. Those words echoed in my head. The kind of cliché line you'd see in a movie. But this wasn't fiction. This was my life, splitting apart at the seams. I stood up and paced, every memory of the last 6 months flooding in. I remembered how she'd suddenly distanced herself from him at our hangouts. I'd assumed she was just tired of his jokes or annoyed by something trivial. I'd never guessed she was trying to cover up an affair. "How long?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She hesitated. 6 months. Half a year. Half a year of lies. Half a year of betrayal. I wanted to scream, but instead I laughed bitterly. But that's why you stopped coming to our meetups? You weren't avoiding him. You were trying not to make it obvious." She didn't deny it. She didn't try to spin it. Emma reached for me, her eyes pleading. "Daniel, please." "No." I stepped back. I couldn't have her touch me. Not after that. All I could think about was Andrew, the guy I'd trusted with everything. The man who'd been at my side through every milestone. And Emma, the woman I'd built my life with. The two people closest to me, living a separate life I hadn't even glimpsed. "He was my best friend," I muttered. "My best friend." Emma's face crumpled again. I didn't have any grand speech or dramatic declaration. I just turned and walked out of the house. I needed air. Space. I wandered aimlessly around the neighborhood, hands shoved deep in my pockets, thoughts tearing through my mind like a storm. I must have looked like a guy who'd just lost everything, because that's exactly how I felt. Andrew. Emma. Two names I never thought I'd say in the same breath like this. I replayed every conversation I'd had with Andrew over the past 6 months, searching for cracks I'd missed. There had to be signs, there always are, right? But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find anything obvious. Andrew had joked about his crazy schedule and long work hours, but nothing that set off any alarms. As for Emma, I kept seeing her face, the way she broke down when I told her about the accident. She didn't cry when my dad passed away. She didn't even cry on our wedding day. Said she wasn't a public tears kind of person. But for Andrew, she collapsed like someone had cut the strings holding her up. By the time I got back home, the sun was setting, and my mind was spinning in exhaustion. Emma was sitting on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, eyes hollow. She'd been crying the whole time I was gone, and yet I didn't feel pity. I felt blank. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. She nodded but didn't move. I stayed standing, arms crossed, because sitting felt too intimate. "I need the truth," I said. "All of it. No more half-truths. No more omissions." "Who started it?" Emma swallowed hard. "It wasn't like that. I didn't plan for any of this. Andrew. He told me he felt alone, like no one really saw him for who he was." "That's rich," I cut in, bitterness slicing through my words. "I was his best friend. I knew everything about him." "Not everything," she whispered. "He was hurting in ways he didn't show you. And She closed her eyes. I didn't expect it to turn into anything. I almost laughed at how familiar that sounded. Didn't expect. So what? You fell in love because you had matching wounds? Because he made you feel special? My voice cracked despite my best effort to hold it together. Emma didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw. "I don't know. I don't have some neat explanation for why it happened, Daniel. I wish I did. I was lonely too. That hit me like a punch." "Lonely?" I repeated, incredulous. "We built a life together. We had plans, a future. You were never alone. You had me." "Did I?" She shot back, the first sign of anger creeping into her voice. "You're always gone, Daniel. Always traveling, always the next project or the next trip." I wasn't trying to excuse it. God, I know I screwed up, but I felt like a placeholder in my own marriage. That stopped me cold. I hated how part of me knew she wasn't entirely wrong. I had buried myself in work. I told myself I was doing it for us, for our stability, our future. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped seeing what Emma needed from me. "Why didn't you just tell me?" I asked softer this time. "If you felt that way, why didn't you say something instead of this?" Her face crumpled again. "Because I was scared it wouldn't matter." The room fell into silence. My mind was torn between rage, grief, and a small, bitter sliver of understanding. "I can't." I started but couldn't finish. I ran a hand through my hair and sank into the armchair across from her. My heart felt like it had been hollowed out. "Did you love him more than me?" The question burned on its way out. Emma's eyes widened, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "No, I loved him, but not the same way. Not the same way." I repeated it like I was tasting the bitterness of each word. "You loved two people at once." She nodded, and that was the worst part. She didn't deny it. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, staring at the floor. I knew I had two choices: fight for a marriage that might be beyond repair, or walk away. But neither felt like a victory. "What do you want, Emma?" I finally asked, my voice breaking. She looked at me like she'd been waiting for that question. "I want you," she said, barely above a whisper. "I want to fix this. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care if it's hard or messy. I just want us to find a way back." I looked at her, really looked at her, the woman I'd built my life with. And for the first time in a long time, I realized just how broken we both were. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling as the minutes turned into hours. Emma was upstairs in the bedroom, but the space between us felt like an ocean. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, Emma and Andrew, together in some parallel version of my life that I never signed up for. By morning, I felt hollowed out. But there was no running from this. I knew that much. I walked into the kitchen, and there she was. She was nursing a cup of coffee, hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around the mug. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine. "You didn't come upstairs," she said softly. "I couldn't," I replied. The words hung there between us, heavy and awkward. "What happens now?" she asked after a long silence. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "I don't know." It was the most honest answer I had. She nodded, as though she'd expected that. Her fingers traced the edge of the cup absently. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked, voice small. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted her out of the house, out of my life. But another part of me was terrified of what that would mean. If she left, that was it, the final nail. "No," I said finally, surprising even myself. Her eyes filled with tears again, and she looked like she wanted to speak, but instead, she just nodded and wiped her face with her sleeve. "I need time," I added. "I can't. I don't even know what I'm supposed to feel right now." "I understand." But did she? Did she really? That day passed in a fog. I went through the motions, checked emails I didn't care about, took phone calls I barely listened to. Meanwhile, the weight of the betrayal clung to me like a shadow. I felt unmoored, like everything I thought I knew had been rewritten. In the afternoon, I found myself standing in front of a framed photo on our bookshelf. It was taken 3 years ago at a cabin trip with friends. Emma was laughing, arms draped over my shoulders, and Andrew was off to the side, mid-laugh himself. I stared at his face and felt a rush of anger, so hot it scared me. I was angry at him for betraying me. But more than that, I was angry at myself for not seeing it, for trusting him, for letting my guard down so completely. That evening, Emma came into the living room while I was nursing a drink. She sat down across from me, her eyes swollen and tired. "I told my parents," she said quietly. I raised my eyebrows. That caught me off guard. "What did they say?" She exhaled shakily. "They were furious. My mom cried. My dad told me I was throwing away the best thing that ever happened to me." She looked down. "They're right." I didn't know what to say to that. "I'm going to therapy," she added. "Alone to start. I don't expect you to come with me. Not yet. But I need to understand why I did this." There was an effort, a tiny flicker of something that looked like responsibility. It was more than I expected from her, but it didn't erase what she'd done. "Good," I muttered. I took another sip, the alcohol burning its way down. "Daniel." I set my glass down harder than I meant to and looked at her. "Stop," I said, more forcefully than I intended. "I need you to stop saying my name like that, like you're begging for forgiveness in every breath. I'm not there. I'm not anywhere near there." Emma's lip quivered, but she didn't argue. She nodded. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You already said that." Silence again. "What about Andrew?" I asked suddenly, the question cutting through the quiet. "Have you spoken to him?" She shook her head quickly. "No, I haven't called him. I wouldn't." "Good." The idea of them talking, even after everything, felt like salt in a wound. "He's still in the hospital?" She nodded. "His mom called me once to update me. I didn't pick up. I blocked her. It was the right thing to do, but it didn't undo the damage." Later that night, I went for another walk. The street was quiet except for the hum of passing cars and the occasional dog barking in someone's yard. The cold air stung my skin, but I welcomed it. I needed something to jolt me awake from this nightmare that felt all too real. I found myself standing at the edge of the park where Andrew and I used to run together on weekends. My fists clenched involuntarily. This was supposed to be the guy I trusted most. "Why?" I whispered into the empty night. "Why did you have to ruin everything?" There was no answer, of course, just the wind rustling through the trees. When I got back home, Emma was already in bed. I sat alone in the living room again, staring into the dark. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. Nothing was ever going to be the same again. The next few days were a blur of muted conversations, empty routines, and long silences. We coexisted in the same space, but it felt like we were living on different planets. Every glance was loaded. Every word felt like a tightrope walk. On the third night, Emma came into the living room again. She didn't sit. She stood by the window, arms crossed over her chest, staring out at the dark. "I know you can't just forget," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "And I'm not asking you to. But I need to know, do you even think there's a chance for us?" I didn't answer right away. I wanted to say something definitive, something strong. But the truth is, I didn't know. "I don't want to lie to you," I said. "I'm not sure I can ever trust you again." She turned to look at me, and in the dim light, she looked smaller, fragile, like someone trying to hold herself together with sheer willpower. "But do you want to?" That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? Wanting and being able to are two very different things. "I don't know," I admitted. "I hate what you did. I hate what it says about everything I thought we were. But there's this stupid part of me that still loves you." Her breath caught, and for a second, I saw the tiniest flicker of hope in her eyes. "But that doesn't mean I can forgive you right now," I added. "It doesn't mean I can pretend like things didn't break between us." She nodded slowly. "I'm not asking you to pretend." We sat in silence again, the weight of everything pressing down on us like a physical thing. The next morning, I got a call from Mrs. Ellis, Andrew's mom. Her voice was hesitant, cautious, as if she wasn't sure I'd even answer. "Daniel, I know this is complicated, but I wanted you to know that Andrew's out of the ICU. He's awake now. asking for you. My heart felt like it twisted in my chest. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to drive to the hospital and demand answers. Demand to see the look on his face when he realized how much he'd wrecked. But another part of me wanted to stay as far away from him as possible. I don't know if I can do that, I said finally. Mrs. Ellis's voice cracked. I understand. But he's not the same, Daniel. The accident, it changed him. He knows what he's lost. I didn't know what to say. I felt sick. Thanks for letting me know. I hung up before I could second-guess myself. That evening, I told Emma about the call. She froze, her face a mixture of shock and fear. You're not going to see him, are you? I don't know. She bit her lip, her hands clenching at her sides. If you do, I need you to know something. He's not the answer. He can't give you closure. Not the kind you need. And you can? I shot back before I could stop myself. She flinched but didn't back down. I can't take back what I did, but I can promise you I'm still here. If you walk out that door, I'll let you go if that's what you need. But I'll fight for us if you give me the chance. Her words hung in the air. There was no manipulation in them, no theatrics. Just a raw truth that twisted something deep inside me. The next morning, I found myself in my car, parked outside the hospital. I stared at the entrance for what felt like hours. Eventually, I started the engine again and drove away. I didn't need to see Andrew. He was no longer part of the story I wanted to tell with my life. When I got home, Emma was sitting at the dining table, staring at her untouched breakfast. When she saw me, her eyes widened slightly, as if she wasn't sure what I'd decided. I didn't go, I said. Her breath left her in a slow, shaky exhale. I stood there for a long time, the unspoken question hanging between us. What now? I'm not saying I forgive you, I said finally. And I'm not saying we'll be okay. But I want to try. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but this time, she didn't break down. She nodded. That's all I needed to hear. We started therapy together a few weeks later. It wasn't some magic solution. Some days were unbearable. I'd see her phone on the table and feel an involuntary stab of panic. We argued. We doubted. I nearly walked out more than once. But we also talked more than we ever had in years. The kind of brutal honesty that either makes or breaks you. I never forgave Andrew. I never reached out to him. Whatever happened to him after the hospital was a story I chose not to follow. Emma and I are still rebuilding, and maybe we'll never be the same. Maybe we're not meant to be. But one thing became painfully clear. Nobody wins in betrayal. Even when you survive the wreckage, the scars stay. And sometimes, survival is the only victory you get.